Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome, audience, to the Talking Deen podcast. I'm your host, Majid, and today I have with me some very special personalities. I have my co hosts, Brother Rash and Brother JK. You'll recognize Brother JK from the Talking Sira podcast. And also, we have a very special guest, Brother Imran Munir, aka Sim, the founder and the host of the Mad Mamluks podcast, and definitely I'd have to say it's definitely in the top 5 Islamic podcasts in the world at the moment. So subhanallah, it's an honor to have you on, Brother Sim.
I thank Jazakallah khair for inviting me. It's a tremendous honor. I spoke to Brother Majid for a while before he started this podcast, and I was so happy to see him succeed with his effort, because a lot of people sometimes just get the idea trapped in their head and they never launch. But alhamdulillah, you guys are consistent and following through with your efforts.
Yeah, subhanallah, we're trying. It's been a bit since the podcast has been going. It's been about a year now, and I remember Sim when we spoke a while back, and that, to be honest with you, that was a motivation for me. The fact that when you said let's see how it goes, because many people start and they drop out. So in yourself, it's a challenge that you set yourself as well, that you don't want to be like the many and you want to be like the few.
Right.
Because in reality, it's only the few that really stick to it. And alhamdulillah, I got a great team around me anyway. Brother Rash and Brother JK. Also, he's the main man on the Talking Sira podcast as well. If you have time, Sim, check that out as well.
I will, inshallah.
Yeah, man. So our listeners, they may recall that I mentioned actually when we were recording our first podcast during the lockdown. And what I mentioned was that we were supposed to have Sim we were on that podcast. But at the time, it wasn't possible because of the lockdown restrictions in Chicago. So Sim, what's the situation in Chicago now in regards to the lockdown? Is it easing up?
Yeah, so Illinois is the state that Chicago resides in. There's obviously, for international listeners, there's 50 states in the United States, and Illinois is one of the few states who is actually following the federal guidelines before opening up the facilities and everything related to the lockdown. So things are much more slower in opening up in Illinois and Chicago than the other states, whereas many of the other states have opened up their gyms and everything. Chicago has not. Chicago has multiple different phases that it's opening things up with, and it seems like there's going to be outdoor dining and things like that that's going to be available to the public within a couple of days. So
alhamdulillah. So things are getting back to I won't say back, but things are getting to the new normal.
Yeah, it'll be the new normal until the numbers spike again, and they're gonna have to lock down again. It seems like it's going to be a back and forth game to control the numbers, unless if the numbers don't actually increase and hit their max peak, then we'll probably be at this new normal. But from what someone described to me, I think this description was apt. The only reason they're lifting up their lockdown is that they have available hospital beds for you if you do end up getting sick. So that's, I guess, the best way to frame it.
Yeah, and probably even in addition to the fact that the economic problem is getting larger than the kind of the health problem at the moment.
Without a doubt. There's so many things that are being impacted related to the lockdown, and there's much debate to be had regarding what is whether the lockdown is actually beneficial, whether it's doing more harm than good because of all the consequences that are happening as a result of it that are not related to COVID-19, but let's just say people not getting the annual health checkups and any other resources that have been tied up to COVID-19 that would have otherwise been allocated to other resources or issues at hand. So
Yeah, subhanallah. Well, inshallah, hopefully things get back to normal anyway. But there's a lot of stuff cracking off in America at the moment, and this is the reason why we wanted to do the podcast. In a way, short notice to a certain degree because of what's going on. We know that on the 27th there was the video that went viral about George Floyd being murdered. You'd have to say he was murdered in front of the public by a police officer called Derek Chauvin. I think that's how you pronounce it. He held him
Yeah.
down with his knee, and since then, things really have kicked off. There's protests, there's rioting, there's looting, and once again, the question of racism in America has come back to the forefront. So that's why we thought, Sim, because you reside in America, wanted to get your perspective, get your thoughts on what's going on, and then we can discuss wider issues to do with racism, capitalism. But what's your initial thoughts of what's kicking off?
So what's right now we're seeing for the international audiences who don't really understand the scope of what's happening is there's about 40 major cities in the United States have had widespread protests, and in some cases, some rioting has been involved, some property damage, looting, and it's important that people understand the differences between all these different layers of protests, because it's all being kind of grouped into one.
Yeah.
And we understand that, as Majid described, there's that the officer who put down his knee on that Michael Floyd, or I'm sorry,
George.
on that gentleman, on his neck, and that wasn't just that was actually something that is part of their routine. If you look in their Minnesota's engagement handbook, in the police handbook that explains how to engage with criminals, that is actually something that is written in there. That is a form of subduing someone during an arrest. So it brings to mind, well, how will this cop actually be prosecuted, or will he actually be convicted for this crime? Because according to the letter of their handbook, he's actually following the procedures or protocol that they laid out for him. And it's important to understand, it's not that wasn't an outrageous and heinous act. It was horrifying in every way. But this is actually written in their rules of engagement with subduing or making arrests and things like that. So it was interesting from my perspective to find that out, and find out when they are issuing an arrest and charging him with third-degree murder. Third-degree murder means like it's not a premeditated crime and things like that. It's like different layers. The most serious offense is first-degree murder in the United States.
It's not homicide.
Yes, right. So we understand that there is some placating to the public happening, and normally he wouldn't have been charged. He probably would have gone free, as other officers have in the past. And I'm not saying I agree with this in any sense. I'm not saying that he should get off or anything like this. But what I really want people to understand is that these are rules of engagement that have been laid out for officers to engage with the public in this inhumane manner. And this officer was really just following what he was trained with,
I think the issue, Sim, is more to do with the fact that the guy wasn't resisting. You know what I mean? I think that's the point.
Yeah, but I think that
he wasn't resisting. He was clearly explaining to the officer that I can't breathe. Ease up. There's many other. Not forget about him. There's other bystanders who are watching this take place, and they're explaining to the officer, "Hey, ease up on him." The person who actually called the police because they thought that he was using some kind of counterfeit money. He called up the owner of the store. He said, they're killing this guy. What should I do? So the clerk at the store, he's calling the owner of the store. He's saying, I don't know what to do. These officers are killing this guy. So this is the setup, or what led to Floyd essentially getting killed by the police officer. Now,
yeah, the other thing that I've noticed from, and just reading from the media, is that some of the narrative in the media, or those like even from the police department, is that this chap George Floyd had underlying health conditions, and although, like you said, they were following protocol and process, and there's this argument that the actions of Derek Chauvin, the police officer, isn't what it was part of it, but it isn't the reason this Floyd died. It was due to his underlying health conditions. So that's an interesting kind of narrative on the whole situation.
And that's a very good point you brought up, JK, because what does a system do when it first sees a dissent, ferment, protests, things like that? There's standard operating procedures related to how systems operate when they see protests and any kind of disruption happening. It's first to discredit, right?
Yeah.
Discredit, disunite, cause divisions within the movement or protests, and further isolate or show the worst possible representatives of the movement to say, hey, you know what, this is what that movement is about. So you see what you were first talking about, right? You're talking about them saying that, hey, this isn't what really happened, right? They're trying to discredit the movement or the protests. Like you're seeing pancakes in the air, it's flying spaghetti or whatever. You're not what you're seeing is not actually happening. So they're trying to discredit the whole notion of what's actually happening, or denying the existence of racism. That, hey, you know what, this only happens in certain pockets of society. It's not necessarily that it happens to everyone, right? And then there is the idea of showing the worst of the protests to society. So when you go turn on CNN, you don't see any of the peace. 99% of the protests that have been happening have been peaceful. But what you see is protests across LA or in Minnesota, and you see warehouses burning and streets being looted. Those are very small sectors of what the protests have transpired to. And many people who I know who have been on the ground, they've called me and said, hey, Sim, I've seen these violent individuals come and take over the rally. They come in droves, and all the peaceful people end up having to move over to the next street over, or they have to get out of their way. And these other people with other objectives in mind, causing property damage, chaos, mayhem, these people are ending up getting all the spotlight. In some instances, they've even seen bricks and other materials that are used to cause damage to property laid out for them while they're, so that it's been like a stack of bricks would be laid out by unknown individuals very early in the morning. Someone would come at night and drop off a big pile of bricks.
Wow.
Right in front of the courthouse or something, or a government building. And the protesters are looking at the camera saying, we know what you're trying to make us do with this, and we're not going to fall for it. So these are the reasonable protesters that they won't show you in the media. The mainstream media won't talk about it. You'll find it in Twitter streams, things like that. But we have to understand how the system is culturing the mind of society and saying, like, hey, these aren't people who are really people who want change. These are people who want to steal, rob, loot. They won't want to take advantage of the horrible situation that we have right now with COVID-19 by wearing masks and things like that, and take advantage. So there's that layer, right? And there's the layer of the protesters themselves. Well, who are they comprised of, right? There are people who, among the protesters, who are just horrible individuals who are taking advantage of the situation. There are people who don't necessarily care at all about racism or any of the issues related to structural oppression or racism. There's just people who are bored at
Opportunists.
home. They're just not going to, and not they're seeing police resources being directed towards these protests, and they're saying, "Oh well, the police are guarding all these peaceful protesters. While they do that, we're going to go ahead and take advantage of the unguarded infrastructure that is related to retail and
Bro, I seen that,
operation."
that video that you shared on Twitter with that, that shop.
Yeah.
I think it might have been a mobile shop and stuff, and the owner was standing there, and that was sad to see.
I think, doesn't this expose also the whole idea of protests in general, and how they're a means that don't really achieve the objectives that, the whole concept of peaceful protesting, whilst it sounds quite fanciful and that is going to create some degree of change, how often do actual peaceful protests even instigate a degree of change, especially when, there are people who are so willing to dive in and utilize mob mentality to cause anarchy and chaos and stuff like that, and actually detract from the very thing people are, probably standing together shoulder to shoulder to try and promote in the first place.
Yeah, many notable ideologues throughout the 20th century. Some of the brightest philosophers and thinkers have said that peaceful protests, they're not completely useless, but they don't really instigate the change that you want to take place in society. But now I'm not necessarily advocating violence, but I'm saying that when you want people to take notice, you want change to really take place. Unfortunately, the human psychology is built towards recognizing eminent or power, right? We are, when people have organized and massed and are displaying power, and are showing resistance by utilizing whatever they have at their means, whatever they can use to push back at the power structures, then the system will say, "Oh, you know what? I'm going to figure out a way to accommodate whatever requests that they have." Now, the system. Do you ever watch the Matrix?
Yeah.
The Matrix.
Who hasn't?
You know how they make adjustments.
Mm.
You know how the Matrix, the agents and whatnot. They make adjustments to the system. So what they'll do in this situation, they're going to take enough change will take place just to
Pacify
put the
people.
public under the boiling point, to control they might introduce some legislation related to engagement with the police training and tactics and things like that. Police may need to have a better form of training procedures and things like that. There might be some reviews like this that are thrown their way. But the idea of institutional racism that's happening, structural racism, that will not change. And if these protesters have, if their goal is only just the engagement with police, then the movement has completely fallen apart at its core. It's flawed at its core, because it's not really addressing the main components that are causing Black Americans, other minorities to fail. And another thing that while I'm on the topic of race is that this idea of I was talking about disuniting the movement, many of the things related to race are coming up. What do I mean by that? Well, why are there white protesters among the Black protesters? You see that question popping up all over Twitter. Well, so what? What if they are? Why can't young white men and women who see the injustice? Why can't they come in and show their hatred for what they saw with the Floyd killing? Well, why is it that me as an Indian, or you, or anyone else with their various ethnicities come and join in solidarity against the injustice that happened with Floyd? So this is another thing that creeps up by disuniting the movement and causing people to say, "Oh, you know what? This is just a black issue. None of you are allowed to talk about it." And there will be people within even the black community who will say this stuff, and there will be black people who will also say, "You know what? Everyone's welcome too." But the people who will get the voice are the people who are saying, "Hey, you're not allowed to talk about this. You're Arab or you're Indian or you're Latino. You're not allowed to talk about our issues." So they try to cause division among a movement that is trying to build momentum and trying to show the system some display of force that, hey, we are a force to be reckoned with. And
yeah,
kind of
and
blabbering on. Sorry.
One I think is a really interesting point you made about non-blacks supporting, Black Lives Matter or whatever movement it may be, whether it be the Floyd issue or all the previous issues that, this isn't something new. It's been going on for a while, and you could say for even beyond, the movements, the modern movements we have now. But one thing that's interesting is that when it comes to these protests, it's interesting that you spoke about how it's being controlled, and there's some sort of maybe some insidious efforts to make it violent. But one thing that I was thinking about is that it's quite understandable to see protests become violent or aggressive, in that, when there seems to be some sort of cycle. So initially, they may try peaceful protest because that's the initial kind of, let's speak out against it. But when you continually see that there's no impact in this activity, or it doesn't lead to any change, as we've seen, this issue seems to be a weekly occurrence, and actually only when it's captured on camera does it come to the forefront. But it must be going on behind, when the cameras aren't being shown, right? So it's a societal issue. But if you're continually seeing that there's no change happening through peaceful protests, it's always going to be automatic that you move on to the next stage, which is becoming a bit more aggressive, and then moving on to actually violence, and then it goes on to looting and fire. And you do start questioning some of the motives, but I think there is some, it's understandable why there's so much anger, even if we don't agree with the whole matter of protests. You can't really take it away from those who are being impacted in these communities during that action.
JK, we have to just parse out what we mean by violent protests, and because it can mean a lot of different things to many different people. So there's the protests that are happening against the police, right, where protesters have started throwing rocks and damaging police vehicles and things like that. That's one component. But then there's also the other component of looters who are damaging private property and committing theft and things like that. So we have to isolate. What happens is violent protests kind of get lumped in together with the looters, and often gets discredited. There is legitimate forms of protests that are violent, but still kind of peaceful, in the sense that they're just damaging police property, but not really harming the police officers' health and safety. So in that respect, like you'll see all over Twitter or social media, you'll see a lot of these vehicles being damaged and things like that. But none of those officers have actually been hurt. Those were police properties that were left on certain streets, and protesters took advantage of them being unoccupied, right? So it's just important to make that distinction, just because people kind of end up lumping everything together and discrediting the violent protests themselves. And by violent, we don't mean killing or hurting specifically, but it's more like the Palestinian rock throwing type of protest, right? It's not really hurting or maiming anyone. Quite the opposite. The police officers themselves, there's a laundry list of how much actual injuries they've caused to people. A reporter, a television photojournalist or something from, I can't remember what exact agency she's from, she lost her eye. She's permanently blinded by a bullet that they fired. I don't know if it was a rubber bullet or a paintball, but
I saw a video with paintball. I saw one video with one
Yeah.
guy firing paintballs at journalists.
Right, and you're seeing. It's so fun to see mainstream media get a pie in their face. When you saw the CNN reporters getting arrested by their own apparatus. CNN is just a tool that's used by the government institutions to control their narrative, and seeing them get arrested, and then later on the governor of the state apologized to CNN, like, we didn't mean for this to happen. That it was just an incidental consequence of what they were trying to accomplish. Normally they would never have problems with CNN, because CNN upholds what their narrative is. They're going to give them the platform, the message that they want to relay to the masses, right? So
it's like you said, though. Like some of the mainstream media will give us a narrative, and especially us here in the UK, we will get that narrative. Always on the when you turn on the news now, it will talk about the violent protests and the looting, and we'll try to discredit all what's happening there, and show that it's just yob mentality. But I think the important distinction, or the comparison you made with the Palestinians, was quite good, in that even in Palestine, anyone who kind of shows some sort of aggression towards Israel is deemed to be the criminals, the terrorists, rather than viewing it as they're the ones that are being victimized and oppressed.
But
I'm sure we'll go.
I was just going to say, Jacob, that the protest you're saying, the thing is that the fact that racism has been going on for a while, right? The fact that we've had, you had the King issue years ago, you had the Ahmed Arbery issue not long ago. The thing is that, if people are affected by this, whether they're black or just say the minority people, right? The thing is, though, would you not say the fact that they vent their anger, whether it's peacefully or with a bit of violence, right? I'm not even talking about the looters. Let's not even bring the looters into this, because they're on their own flex, right? So the people that are protesting, they're protesting against the police. They're damaging police property. But the problem of racism, right, is something which is far beyond the police, right? In reality, you've got the commander-in-chief of America right now, who's a blatant racist, right? So the problem is a societal issue. This is something which is institutional, right? And what happens is that if they are then just, the anger goes against the police, and like Sim said, they make a bit of tweaks in the legislation, about how you can behave and whatever. And then, as if the hundreds of years of racism has disappeared. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's a vicious cycle, which, if the problem isn't addressed, then nothing's going to change, especially not by these protests.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And I think one of the main issues, just like how the Palestinians, when we were talking about how the Palestinians, how they changed the narrative about the Palestinian fight for and their resistance, they make it out to be a violent resistance by showing rock throwing, right? But rock throwing is hardly violence. Exactly. And, these soldiers are armed to the teeth with all kinds of body armor or whatever, and all kinds of security around them. And same with the police over here. They're completely shielded up head to toe. Not a scratch is happening to them. They're not getting a scratch, I promise you. Yes, there are a few incidences of a couple police officers that were overwhelmed by protesters. And I think even in those situations, those other protesters stepped in and separated them from actually getting physically hurt. But what you see by them calling violent protesters, by throwing that label there, that's a way to discredit the movement and say, you know what, these guys, they're not actually here for change. They're actually here to cause disruption, anarchy. They don't really care about it. The actual injustice that happened to Floyd, but rather, just cause harm. And that's important to notice as a viewer, that we have to sift through the narrative that's being pushed. Now, I'm curious as an American to see what you guys are seeing in the UK, from what you see in the media. How is, because I know what I've heard is at least some protests have started even in the UK as well.
Yeah, there was a protest today in London, wasn't there? Again, quite a lot of people just, again, classed as it was peaceful protest, a fair number of people. But again, I think the story is such that it has got out into, it's a worldwide story, obviously now. There's going to be worldwide protests, which is exactly what we're seeing here. What JK said earlier on about the fact that I think what we're seeing is because the footage is available, it's made the issue come to the fore more, rather than it just being a story or a headline. That footage has been like Maj said earlier, completely viral. So everybody's seen the image of the officer with his knee on the throat of George Floyd. So that in itself has become quite symbolic, and that I think has helped the movement across the globe in terms of protest.
The other point about the protests in London and Peckham is that the call or rallying call on the placards has been that we are not innocent. So what they're trying to say is that even the UK has not as much as America, but has had its fair share of whether it be police brutality or brutality from the authorities, like Mark Duggan example, for example, that they're trying to show that this isn't just an American issue. It's an issue that is impacting lots of Western countries, and it's in line with what Maj was saying, that we can't just view it as something that's just in the police authority in America that need to clean up their act and then the problem will go away. In fact, this issue has been boiling up for decades, hundreds of years actually, and it is systematic. It's within the system of capitalism. I'm sure we'll go on to discuss this, but many countries have been impacted by it. It's just that some of the incidents in America have come to the forefront and are probably a bit more blatant than other countries. It's a bit probably softer type of discrimination.
Now, in capitalist philosophy, okay, let me ask you guys this: do you find talk from people like Adam Smith related to the white people being superior to black people? Do you find tenets of racism within capitalist philosophy when you go take econ classes in university? Do you find racist ideas in their texts? No, right? I mean,
No.
You don't find anything related to that. So why is it that these capitalist societies are fermenting racism, structural racism? That's the question.
I mean, I studied economics at university, right? So probably a good place to start is what was my experience of studying economics? Well, we spoke about Adam Smith, spoke about Marx and others in their theories and philosophies and modern day capitalism today as well. And you're right, there's no blatant remarks of the white race being superior. But to me back then, I would never ever envision capitalism to be a racist ideology. However, learning more, reading more, what you do find is one of the cruxes of capitalism is that there is this difference between the capitalists being superior to the lower class and those that are the labor class, for example. And who are the capitalists? The capitalists are generically the white man. And when we say the white man,
can't argue that.
The white man. Sometimes I used to have discussions before when people used to, I don't know whether you know, but when people say Gora and they say the white man, sometimes it comes across a bit derogatory and like, Muslim can be white.
Yeah.
But we have to also understand is when we say white man, we're not talking about the color per se. We're talking about those elitists, those that have been at the top of the pyramid and have been, controlling the way the world and the order goes. Yeah. And their philosophy has always been, as Adam Smith said, is individualism. So they will do what is required for them to succeed, and at the expense of everyone else. So
exactly.
This is how,
and that is. I want the listeners to just pay attention to what JK just said. This is very important in regards to understanding capitalist ideology versus what Muslims and Islam teaches us. Me, the number one principle in the capitalist ideology, the selfish center, everything emanates from that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That is their creed. That is their shahada. Me, my interests, and how do I benefit?
Exactly.
If I do something that benefits my neighbor is happy. He'll be happy with me. He won't complain about me. That's not how Islam teaches us to be. Why we should be caring for our neighbor, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because this is the employer who takes care of his workers, gives them a raise. He's giving them a raise because they will be better workers for him. You see how it comes back to him and himself, and how they will be better productivity in his industry, or in his enterprise.
Thing is,
Right?
for Muslims, our criteria for actions is halal and haram. For capitalism, the criteria is expediency.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's all about me. What can I gain from it? To hell with the others.
Right. So if there weren't any black people in America, you think racism or oppression would take place? Absolutely. It would just find its way to different sectors of poverty. People who are poor and destitute and they're in bad economic situations. They would have been the people who bear the brunt of the systemic oppression that's taking place. Just like how on a macro level, we're seeing how in globalism we're seeing Western capitalist governments take advantage of all the various cheap labor that happens all across Asia and Africa, and Southeast Asia. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as slavery, but they just found out, oh, well, you know what? It doesn't come with a negative connotation as of the word slavery, but where instead of giving them $0, we're giving them 50 cents an hour.
Exactly.
You know?
One of the
way
first
to look at it.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, another way to look at it is, whilst the theory in capitalism might not be apparently racist, actually capitalism and nationalism is what gives oxygen to racism.
Yeah.
Because these national borders and our national identity, and us thinking we're better than someone who is across the other side of the border, or even a capitalist thinking I'm more valuable than that person who is in poverty. That in itself gives the very oxygen that creates this, this us and them, creates this racism.
You know what? I will say that the power structures don't even like nationalist ideologies. These pro ultra right wing ideologies that are advocating for their superiority over other races. They don't like it because they operate in the shadows. They don't want their oppression to be apparent like that. Yeah. They don't want people to understand things like in such pardon the pun, black and white way. They don't want it so apparent. It should be very thinly veiled, and that's how they usually operate. They don't like to operate in a way that where the neo-Nazis operate.
Whether they like it or not, it emanates from their creed.
No, it emanates from colonialism, right? Colonialism, it laid the way for capitalist industries and capitalist societies to flourish, right?
Yes, of course.
And what we're seeing right now is a consequence of what colonialism has done throughout the world, where a select group of white men and white societies were able to distance themselves from the rest of humanity by a large portion. Right now, there is, I would say, around 250,000 people on Earth who control over around, I want to say, 20% of the world's resources or wealth, essentially. 250,000, roughly.
Well, I think even in America, if you just take America alone, I think I read a few hundred Americans own something like almost the equivalent of what the American defense budget is per year.
Absolutely.
So the influence that those people have in terms of, like, you're right, maybe nationalism isn't even the thing for them. For them, it's almost that they don't want to be in the limelight as being we're American, but they're the elitists that behind the scenes, because of that major wealth gap that there is, and all of these problems that stem from it, they're the ones that are influencing a lot of this. And I think that's part of the problem with protests as well sometimes, is because who are you protesting? You're protesting those same power structures in order for those same influentials to make changes to the very system that they're actually in control of. How is change ever going to occur?
How many of those police officers did you see in the protest that were from various different backgrounds of ethnicities? I saw Asians there. I saw African Americans there. I saw these police officers of various colors and ethnicities. So that's not the problem. The problem is that these police officers are upholding the wealth and the interests of the select 1% of society. And even those officers are too dumb to know it. They don't know what they're even upholding. They're just, they've given them
well, Sim, that's why I'm glad you
some bylines, some guidelines of, you know what, you police officers, you're a brotherhood. You have to get your other, you have to have the back of your other police officer. You never snitch on them. And they give them a code and some sort of fraternity between them, and then they end up becoming a shield or a buffer from the masses, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I'm glad Sim mentioned that point about, the idea of the blame is on the police. Yeah, the blame is on the police because they're almost that front line to the oppressive structural oppression that is there already. So it's easy to blame them. But like you said, in some of the handbooks and stuff, if they're saying, these are the things you're allowed to do, and then once they do them and they get found out for it, they're the ones that are having the book thrown at them. What's happening the whole time is that structural oppression that has actually led to that. Even the Black Lives Matter and even those people protesting against people are protesting sometimes for a change of policy within the police. But actually, that's not going to change anything.
Right. And just imagine for a second, if that 1% of 1% in America, let's just say they were a multitude of ethnicities, Black, Hispanic, Muslim, you think things would change? Absolutely not, because the creed of capitalism is still existing within them, right? The creed of my interests, my protection, my industries, those selfish inherent principles are still within them, and they will still continue to manifest the way they do with the structural racism that you see play out in society. So it's not how a lot of the critical race theorists will have you believe that it's a war between white and black. It's a war between capitalism and humanity
and society. And just I think you made a key point, Sim, in that if we look at the history of capitalism and where the birth of capitalism came from, it did come at the back of colonialism. So at the end of colonialism, or the historic version of colonialism exists today. It's just a new form. But the historic colonialism, where there would be a land grab, in fact, that's where capitalism bore itself from. And how many people know that one of the first products of capitalism, or merchant capitalism, which was its early form, how many know that one of the first products was slavery? It was the transatlantic slave trade was one of the first products of capitalism. Yeah. So if this is where it was born from, right? If this is the birth of capitalism, then no wonder this racism, racism is part and parcel of that. And the distinction I make is that racism isn't a product of capitalism, because that would be like saying that it never existed before capitalism. But obviously it did. It existed amongst the Arabs. It existed even from day one. You could argue that Shaitan was a racist, in that he was racist against the insan. But, we won't go into all of that. But what I'm saying is racism has existed. But what capitalism did, it adopted. It was easily acceptable, nationalist tendencies and having that view that one nation or one people are more superior to another people. It adopted that, and it thrives on it.
You brought an amazing point up with talking about Iblis and his racism, because racism is a form of arrogance, right?
Yeah, definitely.
This is and Iblis' ultimate crime was his arrogance, right?
Exactly.
And when you see the various branches of arrogance. You see racism and some of these other distinctions that people make amongst each other with related to wealth and things like that, right? So it's not just race, but also other barriers people make amongst each other to feel better than other human beings. And why humility and asking for forgiveness and these values are they're so important in Islam, and it's why what makes us different as Muslims, and why we should take so much pride in and thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for blessing us with Islam, because ultimately it's not we're not only satisfying or meeting hoping to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we're really bettering ourselves at the end of the day. We're lightening our load, and we're becoming better human beings at the end of the day.
Yeah, and so, if you think back to a famous quote by the late Malcolm X, may Allah reward him Jannah, is when he said that the solution for racism in America is Islam. And he said this after he had traveled to Mecca, Medina, after he had traveled the Muslim lands, where he said himself, in a letter to his wife Betty Shabazz, that look, I've sat with the white, with the red, and subhanallah, he certainly he must have come across the hadith of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he said that the white is not superior to the black, and the red to the white, and the Arab to the non-Arab. So without Islam, when we talk about a bond, if you think about a bond that can unite people, there are many bonds, and they will all fail. For example, patriotism as a bond will fail because it only really comes into play when there's an external threat to the land. Okay, nationalism will always fail as well, because of the fact that it will even have issues from the structure within. Okay, because everybody wants dominance. So what we can see is that what really can unify mankind has to be an ideological and intellectual bond. Okay, now capitalism is certainly an ideology. It has an intellectual aqidah, and from within this, a system emanates on how it does business and how economy and whatever the rules to how to implement the solutions that it has for man's problems, right? But we see inherently this system is flawed, and the reason why it's flawed is because it's from the aql of man. A man himself is flawed. He's limited. So we see that Islam is the only deen, the only bond really that can unite mankind, because it's not from man, it's from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, and this is what Malcolm X was saying all that time back. And I think, to be honest with you, it's worth discussing now, certainly for because there may be non-Muslims that are also listening to this podcast, the fact that we can clearly say that Islam has the solution to racism.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Islam safeguards and makes distinctions between what is good for you and what isn't bad for you. The reason why capitalism doesn't have anything to say about racism, it's not because that it doesn't care. It's just it actually says it's irrelevant. All that's relevant is your pleasure. It's made essential truths. It's recognized essential truths like power, pleasure, wealth. These are ultimate truths that certainly Islam also recognizes, but has parameters around. For capitalism, there are no parameters. It's a race for everyone.
The thing is, Sim, is in capitalism, it only entertains the materialistic value. When it comes down to the humanitarian value, the ethical value, the spiritual value, it has no room, it has no place in capitalism. So what you're saying is bang on in the fact that it doesn't even want to entertain this.
Yeah. And it only recognizes the ultimate truths: power, wealth, pleasure. And how can you attain that? And if there is some harm that can happen as a result of certain things being part of your economy, then you may have to get rid of those. Over the overall sense of public welfare needs to exist in order for the economy to continue. And something that's actually reminds us of why the COVID-19 will eventually, and if it not already, is being kind of brushed under the rug, and it needs the vehicle, the wheels of capitalism need to move again. and whatever threat that COVID-19, let's just say, I don't know, there's a lot of debate about the actual threat and all that. Let's just say COVID-19 is the worst plague that can befall humanity. Eventually, forces will come to play that will discredit it and start blaming other symptoms or things related to COVID-19 that aren't necessarily for the benefit of the public, but because they need to get the economy moving, they're going to discredit it.
Even in capitalist theory, they talk about cost-benefit analysis, don't they? And for them, the life of a human being can be measured. So
Yes.
that would be part of the analysis. And when it comes to that point, and it's already reached that point, when they recognize that actually the economy is going to suffer as a result of the lockdown and the fact that shops have to close, they will make that call, even if it means a threat to life and it means death. Because for them, and there's been like senators that have come out and said, I'm willing to die for the system. As long as I can, even if I have to go and work and as a result I get coronavirus and I die, as long as my children and the system prevails and the economic system and capitalism stays intact, that is what is important to me. And that's capitalism for you. And like Sim's saying, it doesn't need to they don't need to be distinguished in race, as long as the parameters is that I'm seeking my own pleasure. And whatever barrier that may come in place, it doesn't matter, whether it be skin color or race or the other. Mexicans, for example, they're not black, but actually they're seen as the other. So it doesn't really matter. I think it is worth discussing how Islam is the only way or the only deen that did, and the history testifies that it eradicated racism, even though it was entrenched within Arab society. So it's nothing new. It's not like this is a new issue. Even the Arabs were racist. Right,
it's only returned because of the influence. Like many people can say, "Oh, well, you should go to Muslim countries; you'll see racism completely take place." These institutions, after the Islamic institutions were wiped off the map in Muslim countries, that is only when they were replaced with colonialism that these things like racism ended up fermenting and taking place in society. And why you see so many issues like colorism and things take place in our Muslim societies is because of the effect that colonial empires left in our countries. It wasn't as a result of Islam and Muslims. As quite the opposite. You saw a very nice medley or blend of Muslims all across the various regions from North Africa to the Levant to Turkey to all the way to India. You see a blend of various ethnicities. And when you study the Muslim populations, at least even in India, which is kind of the outer skirts of the Islamic empires, you'll see so many different ethnicities.
But just quick point is the fact that you said when the colonialists left, and I think it's somewhat important, is that they never left. They're still there today, and that's
right. Absolutely. Exactly.
And, part of that is from, people should study about, communism as well, because a lot of the change in style that came from the capitalists in terms of, say, for instance, some of the issues of racism somewhat diminished, or some of the social problems in some of these Western nations diminish. Often, even if they diminish, their foreign policy and their oppression elsewhere continues. And that's because often what happened previously is when socialism and communism came on the scene, the capitalists had to change their styles. It was a direct reaction to that. They recognized that, wait there a minute, people will warm towards socialism and communism because actually the direct colonialism is clearly bad. So they had to try new styles to do indirect colonialism, or what we call today neo-colonialism, in order to continue that capitalist way of, exploiting the whole world. That capitalism and exploitation comes hand in hand, and that's where racism is born out of that, whether it's part of its political theory or not.
Actually, just to point add to that, Rash, the Americans used the anti-colonialist protests within the Muslim lands, for example, to remove the British and French influence, given though they were number one colonialists, but their style was different.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a really interesting point, because we've discussed protests not really achieving the outcome that people want, because you're still asking the existing system for change. And a system that is rotten will never give fruits that are pure. You can't seek change through a system that has the root of it, which is the root of the problem. So the answer really is removing that system and replacing it with an alternative system, right? But someone may ask that, what about communism? What about socialism? What about all these other systems? We'll discuss Islam, but all these other systems that oppose capitalism, will they resolve the problem? But the reality is, if you look at communism when it did have its time for a short period, and look at the previous Eastern European states as well as China, who are inclined towards this style of thinking, or they were, they're the most racist nations on earth. If you go to Eastern European, you can't. If we were to walk in some of these areas, you'd get clear, blatant racism. And if you think about China, China's known to be racist against black people, and so all these other alternative systems have proven to have this nationalist tendency, and this tendency to have this superiority of one race over the other. And it is only Islam that, when the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam came, there's countless examples. If you go back to the Seerah, in which Allah and Islam liberated every person, and the only distinction of man was his piety, his taqwa. And there's this hadith that before we had this session, I don't want to paraphrase, I want to read it out because it's beautiful and I don't want to ruin it. But the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam said, Allah Most High has removed from you the pride of the pre-Islamic period, meaning Jahiliyyah, and its boasting in its ancestors. One is only a pious believer or a miserable sinner. So that's the distinction. You're either a pious believer or you're a miserable sinner. That's the only way that Allah will account you, or you be greater than one another. And then the Messenger said that you are sons of Adam, and Adam came from dust. Let the people cease to boast about their ancestors. They are merely fuel in Jahannam, or they will certainly be less account with Allah than a beetle which rolls in dung. So the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has clearly outlined to us, and you also mentioned, in his final khutbah, where he said that, no Arab is superior than a non-Arab. So the Messenger Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam is telling us that it is your taqwa and your piety that is the most important thing, and everything else, whether it be color, gender, anything else doesn't really matter. And this is what's so beautiful about Islam. And I'd argue to say that is the only system that eradicated racism.
Just to add to that, JK, as a Rush will remember, many years ago, we was like in university, we were just having a circle with some of the students there, and there must have been about 15 at least.
Okay.
And we were just chatting about the Deen, and you know what I mean, and you got to understand that these are young lads who are away from their homes. They could be doing anything on a Friday night, but they were willing to come and sit with us and chat. And one thing that we just pointed out, we looked around and said, every single one of us was from a different national background, right? And it was just the fact that we were there for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nothing to gain from each other, right?
Yeah.
And this united us in a way which no one else, I believe, can unite in that way. And one thing I did say to the guys at the time is, people talk about disunity in the ummah. What I believe is, and maybe you guys may disagree, I believe that emotionally, from the heart, we're one ummah, we're together emotionally, right? What we lack is political unity. And until we don't have political unity, that unity as an ummah cannot really be illustrated as such. It can by certain events, maybe at the Hajj or maybe Umrah, when people go and, you don't see any discrimination, right? But until the people who are in the authority in the Muslim lands, they're the stooges and they're the puppets of the same capitalists we're on about. They're there to further show that we're different to the neighboring country. That's their job. And I think that You know, what was beautiful is the fact that, you know, that feeling of just meeting a random guy in the street and saying assalamu alaikum, and that guy responding. You know, I remember Adris told me once he used to sell mobile phones, and he was like in the middle of a shopping center, and his colleague was a non-Muslim, and Adris was like, every Muslim, assalamu alaikum, right? And then the guy said to him, he goes, "No, you know a lot of people." He goes, "I don't know." He said, "I don't know them. They're just Muslims." That guy couldn't understand the point that, you know, you would approach someone, and you know, normally when someone like a salesman approaches you, think, "Oh, brother, I don't want to speak to this guy," right? You know what I mean? So you're approaching someone, but they're happy to respond, and they don't even know you. And subhanAllah, you know, for me personally, is, you know, only Islam can, and the reality testifies for this. But unfortunately, the point I made is, until we don't have political unity, we can't illustrate this beauty to the rest of the world, whether it's America, whether it's in the UK. You know, they will always feel that even though there's inherent problems in the current system, it's the best thing going. Up until there's not an alternative model that you can show as an example, unfortunately, you know, I can't see the situation getting better. Even if people protest, they will protest for tweaks. Only when there's a real model on the other side will they protest and say, "We want that model." You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, do you know what I'd agree with? Someone may argue that there's some inner, you know, subconscious racism within our communities. For example, you know, what I've found that's come to the forefront of the discussion on Instagram and on Facebook and others is that even within our subcontinent community, would our parents allow us to marry a black woman, or vice versa, you know, a girl to marry a black husband? And, you know, there may be some sort of intrinsic hatred or dislike for black or of the other. And yeah, it's true. You know, there's this, but this isn't attributed to Islam. It's attributed to culture. It's attributed to previous Hindu culture, perhaps, that may be there. But I am inclined to agree with you, Majin, that without political unity, some of these things are there, and they can only be resolved through Islam and a society that's governed by Islam. So the example I'll give you is that, you know, the Aus and Khazraj, yeah, they were the best of the best. They were the Ansar. You know, they were the ones that supported the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina. But one word of that Jewish boy, you know, who tried to cause disunity within them, they were almost at war with each other. Aus and Khazraj, they've been Muslim, yeah. So when that one, you know, inclination of the Jewish boy talking about previous wars they had and nearly caused disunity, that the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam heard of this and came back and said, you know, how can, whilst I'm among you, you're going to disunite? What would happen if I wasn't even here? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the famous verse, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا, and hold on to the rope of Allah and be not divided. You know, that was a verse that was revealed. And what that shows is that only through that unity will any of these inclinations towards one tribe or people being superior to the other will be removed, because our unity will be based on that Islamic bond, as you were saying. So I think that's the point. It may exist, but without that unity, without that society of Islam, we won't see it kind of flourish.
Absolutely. That was a great point that you made, JK. Without a doubt, until we recognize the institutions that are in place within our own societies, Muslim societies, and within our minds, how we've internalized core beliefs related to capitalism, that we think that, oh, you know, well, I'm not capitalist. Well, when was the last time I helped out someone that didn't need necessarily, that couldn't have benefited me at all? Let's just say one of the things I do is I go and whenever I'm visiting a different place in the world or in the States, I find out if there's any of my friends who are trying to start a podcast or starting some kind of institution related to Islam up, and I'll see if I can help them out in any way. Not because I need any help from them, but because thinking ideologically and as a Muslim who wants to further the message and the cause of Islam and Muslims, we think along the lines of something completely different, where we do not try to offer help because we're going to get help later on. I don't help JK out with something because JK will come onto my podcast later on, and help me out with financially or something like that. But that's not how Muslims think. But this is how the capitalist mind trains you to think. Oh, well, when are you guys going to start monetizing, and when are you going to start advertising, and when are you going to do this and that and that? Because we've internalized these values. We've internalized it because Islam is no longer something that provides comfort and benefit to our families and our core values, but it's become a money-making scheme as well, you know? So it's become a place where we capitalize off of, and we've tried to benefit. I'm not saying there are not, added benefits of being on YouTube, where, YouTube gives you some measure of money or for putting up your videos, but even that, it's very small unless you're a multi-million subscriber podcast. It's a very small amount of money. I think even the largest Muslim YouTubers like Ali Dawa and Muhammad Hijab, they barely make anything off of YouTube. So I think one of the things we have to understand is that I have to credit them, because many other Muslims who would be in their shoes would be promoting the heck out of themselves, utilizing many kind of different promotional advertising, other enterprises that would lend themselves to promoting their products on their channels and things like that. But I'm not completely against advertising. I don't want people to think that I'm completely against people making and earning a living, but I'm against people internalizing these values where it's become a basis of their thinking. The substrate of their patterns of thinking have become a profit, income, elevating themselves in society to get bigger homes, faster cars, beautiful women, or whatever, So these are things that have kind of place themselves in our mind without even knowing. You have to really do some thinking to kind of comb out wherever these poisonous ideas have kind of settled themselves in.
To be honest, I think we're all affected, aren't we?
Yeah,
we are. And if I'd be lying if I had said that it doesn't affect me at all. It's a daily thing in how I kind of process things out, and I try to think like how is this how Allah and His Messenger would have wanted me to behave in regards to the situation.
You should ask the children, put up a video on YouTube, for example, and like, or even before YouTube, that go on YouTube, man, you make bare money. I was like, listen, I'll get 1 or 2 views, I'm a long way, but it's just like Sim saying, is like, it's just that in the fact that they mention that, they link it, even though they know you're doing it for dawah, but they link it to a monetary benefit.
Yeah.
It comes from the fact that there's a lot of people on YouTube, a lot of the really, really big people, especially the non-Muslim ones, that, seem to do nothing other than record YouTube videos, and I've got these huge houses and cars and stuff. And children from a very young age, unfortunately, in this capitalist society, are being exposed to that. And just to broaden the point as well, I think what I was going to mention earlier is what's interesting is even those very people who critique capitalism, critique democracy, what they end up presenting, because of your point earlier, what they end up presenting is a tweaked or a slightly changed version of capitalism, or a slightly different version of democracy, change something, rather than thinking, what, a lot of these problems that, our youth are now facing is a product of this system. And actually the only way to alleviate that is to present an alternative system. And because they don't know what that alternative system is, whilst Islam is being alienized and shown in a very negative light, they won't see that alternative system or know about that alternative system. A good example of this is there are now non-Muslim organizations and people who are thinkers saying we should implement the Islamic economic system, because our economic system is failing. The rich-poor divide is increasing. Poverty in the world is increasing, even though we think we're we're the best civilization out there. Actually, Islam as an economic system was able to correct some of these, distribution issues, and Islam as an economic system is better than the Western capitalist economic system. Let's try and take that in isolation and somehow try and fit it within the capitalist model. And that's just because they cannot see an alternative to solve the problems that are in a product of their inherent flawed system.
Rash, it's amazing you brought that point up, because it's our own scholars. It's sad to say that within
That's true.
mainstream scholars who will say, well, what's the difference between the Islamic economic system and the American capitalist system? And it's so shocking that they don't understand some of the basic tenets of what the American capitalist thinking and the philosophy behind things is in relation to how they engage with society, and how Islam engages with, at least in an economic model, right? In how they frame their truths related to how transactions take place between humans, and how justice and fairness and equality are framed in Islam versus capitalist. And then you say like, oh well, I don't understand why these Black Lives Matter movements and police brutality take place. Well, I thought you said everything was fair. I thought there was no distinction between Islamic economics and capitalist economics. And then now you're saying there's structural oppression, because now you see like them just kind of moving from whatever breeze or whatever social current is taking them. They're just kind of hopping onto this from one to another, with no like cohesive argument, no coherent argument that is kind of put together and offering society, well, hey, you know what, you guys are in a mess over here, but we as Muslims, we've had this tried and tested method for 1400 years that has benefited our societies for a large part, and has allowed us to coexist with many different ethnicities and colors and races all together. No, you don't see any of that. You see, oh well, you know what, we have to do better as our individual skin color and our ethnicities. We have to understand each other better. Completely falling into the traps that they want you to get busy with. That, oh, you know what, this is a war of race and a war of black versus white. It's not. It's a consequence of it. What you're seeing, this racism, is a consequence of capitalism and things like that. But at the heart of it, as JK was outlining earlier, Adam Smith and them, they don't talk anything about black versus white or white. There might be a little bit of some other Enlightenment philosophers who had a couple of racist ideas here and there, but for the most part, there was very little.
I think they used Darwinism. I think quite conveniently, Sim.
Yeah. Well, but, and still, that's not the basis of what their thinking is.
No.
They're exploiting. They've realized like, what is the fastest or the path of the least resistance in society? Well, here are the various areas in society that I can exploit to reach my objective as fast as possible. And that's what it comes down to with capitalism. Which laws, which morals can I skirt by taking advantage of these holes in the system and further benefiting myself.
I think it just causes a massive distraction, whether it's Muslims or non-Muslims. All these things do, and whether the scholars are contributing intentionally or unintentionally, we don't know what that is within their hearts. But a lot of it causes a distraction, so that Muslims themselves start to think, okay, well, that means we can somehow utilize elements of Islam to fix problems that we see today. But in actual fact, it's those very scholars who should understand that the systems that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us are holistic. The economic system is linked to the social system. If you try to implement one without the other, inherently you won't get the values or all of the values that are designed for that divine system in the first place. And I think it's a responsibility of the scholars to clarify that for us, but often that doesn't seem to be happening.
But Rash, just to add to that as well, is that, the question also might be how many people really understand what Islam is. And or what I mean by that is that if people think about there's a war, if people say there's a war in Islam, people get confused thinking actually, who is it, Christianity versus Islam? Who's at war here? Because they view Islam as a religion. But if people could understand that after the fall of communism, the only people who had a creed, an aqidah, which, okay, it wasn't on the political sphere, but is an obstacle to complete control of capitalism across the world, is in the Muslim lands. So when we see what's going on today and what has been going on, the war on terror, i.e. the war on Islam, what we can see is that, definitely there's the booty, i.e. the resources, the raw materials. Certainly that's something which appeals to the capitalists. But the main reason why we see this ongoing struggle between Islam and capitalism isn't due to entirely the resources, is due to the fact that the capitalists, after the fall of communism, which was an ideological war, they now know around the world there is only a certain people who don't just have the answers for what's before life and what's after life. They have a complete system that links it into the dunya, which gives you a social system, an economic system, a complete foreign policy, everything. It's just in the Muslim lands. So that's why, the ongoing struggle that we see in Muslim lands as well is due to the fact that the capitalists, the Muslims really are the only obstacle they faced for complete control of the entire world.
Mm. Yeah, I'd agree with that. And we're probably going to come to a close soon. But one thing I think audience should take away is that, racism, we're talking about racism today, we're talking about nationalism and the other. But actually, I don't want to belittle it because it is quite emotional and things are going on. I get it. But actually, it's a symptom of many problems. The fact that poverty exists in these areas that are protesting, the fact that there's inequality, the fact that there's continues to be sexism, where they objectify women. All of these are just symptoms of this capitalist problem, the problem of capitalism. And when we understand Islam as an idea, as an ideology, and the fact that it's not a set of policies, you can't just adopt the economic policy and then just apply it to capitalism. It doesn't work like that. As you were saying, that you have to adopt the idea. The idea of zakat, right? Zakat isn't a wealth tax in that it's just a tax and viewed as a tax as we see in this system, but actually it's something that's an ibadah. It's something that we want to do. So without that understanding of zakat, you can't apply zakat on a people who don't understand it. Otherwise, it's something else. It's not zakat. So what I'm trying to say is that all of these issues that we find, whether it be in America or the UK or across the world per se, right? They're all symptoms of the underlying issue, which is the lack of Islam, the absence of Islam, which is the truth. And we shouldn't shy away from saying that. We have the truth. And only when that's implemented that we'll see these problems. I'm not trying to paint a utopia. It's not going to be a utopia, but it is the best system, the perfect system that when applied, even if applied not 100% accurately, will resolve many of the issues.
And it's the best system because it's from the creator. I think that's important.
Yeah.
Obviously we're speaking about capitalism, but any ism other than Islam is bound to fail purely because it's from man's limited mind, and only the creator can provide a system which can actually manage man's affairs in an optimal way, purely because he is the creator and no one understands the creation better than the creator himself. So I think that's a very important point you made there, JK. But subhanallah, I think we've spoken about a lot of things and time's ticking. There's so much to speak about. I mean, we could speak about the war on Islam and stuff like that, but I know that's not the topic. It was leading to that, and I had to get that bit in because yes, we're speaking about racism, but one guy has been killed, but the reality is that and I'm not belittling that in any way, but what's happening in the Muslim lands, whether it's in India, whether it's in Palestine, China, East Turkmenistan, in Iraq, in Syria, it's just subhanallah, if we were to do protests for these incidents, we'll be protesting non-stop 24 hours a day, but that's obviously not the topic for this podcast. So to inshallah bring it to a close, any final comments that you guys want to add to the discussion? I'll start with you, our special guest, Sim.
No, I just want to emphasize that we work on ourselves first. The problem that we're seeing with the black people in America is a downfall from the basic family unit. The black man and woman, they're being raised in homes that there's an absent father. On every level of society, they are being oppressed. They have black leaders have failed them. They're in the pockets of their white
Oppressors.
Oppressors. They're really, it's just a game of exploitation, and they are the lowest common denominator, and they're being taken advantage of on every level of society. So it's really important that we as individuals, we not only work on ourselves but our families, and then so on, and we make sure that our basic unit in society, our family, is strong, and we protect ourselves and we arm ourselves with strong ideas, and be careful of what kind of influences are corrupting our family, and how we guard ourselves from whatever influences our children are absorbing through media and television and so on, because it's just a war out there. I know, I'm a parent myself, and I battle with my kids about how much they use Instagram and TikTok and things like that. I'm not saying I'm the perfect parent and I've got it all figured out, but we all have to figure out what we can do to best mitigate the harmful impact that capitalist societies put on our families. So just be sure you all, everyone who's listening, just think about that for a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, man. The thing is the thing is, before, when I was growing up, it was, you'd get influenced outside the home, but now you have people within the home. They don't even need to leave the house, and they'll be influenced. And the thing is you can, and I think, Sim, just to sort of like resonate with your point, is that we can talk about this great battle and participating in this great battle for domination of the entire world, when in fact we might be losing the battle at home. And and that's something that we all need to think about, reflect upon. JK, any final points, brother?
The only thing, just to add really quickly, is that with this issue of George Floyd, I know that people have been raising awareness of it, and that's great to see. Like, it's good to see that people are sharing it. But one thing that I would ask is that, yes, fair enough, share it and raise awareness, but don't let it just become like a bandwagon effect. That when the media speaks about it, when it becomes an issue that's highlighted that everyone's speaking about, you share it. Rather, share it, raise awareness, but also look at some of the deep issues. And as we've discussed, what is the root cause of this? Look at the deep, try to understand it a bit more deeply, and then ask ourselves that clear question of what is the actual solution that will resolve? What are we seeking? Are we seeking social justice? Or in fact, are we seeking Islamic justice? And whether it be for racism or for any other matter, social justice is a term that's being used, right? But actually, as Muslims, we're seeking Islamic justice, the justice from Allah, right? And that can be implemented in this world that we live in, and where it doesn't, and where people get away, they'll see the ultimate justice from Allah in the hereafter. So that's the one ask I ask of people, that look into issues a bit more deeply and don't let it just become a bandwagon. Otherwise, we'll find that we share issues and don't really look into it deeply.
Yeah, bang on, bro. Bang on. And Brother Rash?
We say Alhamdulillah, because at a micro level, we have Islam that is going to help us protect ourselves, protect our families. And as Brother Sim is saying, is that it's going to allow us to give our children and our families that filter, so that we actually protect them from this. But sometimes the issue is, if we just look at a micro level and don't look at the macro level as well, we will forever be just looking after our own bubble of people or our own families, and the root cause will never be solved. So I think we need to do a bit of both. Yeah, we no doubt we actually make sure our families are protected, and sometimes we do neglect that. So no doubt we protect our children from this, but at the same time, like these kind of avenues like podcasts and like raising awareness, as JK is saying, we do need to speak out for the macro level solution to these, because otherwise it all turns into everybody's message becomes you perfect yourself, you sort yourselves out and your family out, and somehow that's going to achieve the end goal. But actually it has to be a bit more than that. It has to be a balanced effort of doing the micro but also focusing on the macro, and that would be my message.
Yeah, subhanallah, man. The only thing I'd add to that really is that as Muslims, I think a lot of us have to look into what it means to even to be a Muslim. And I've always said this before, that we see people just walking around the streets and living their normal lives. A Muslim's not about that. We are the inheritors of the mission of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We are here to bring light to darkness, to bring order to chaos. That is what it means to be a Muslim. It's just so much more than just living your own life, just watching your Netflix and something I say. So if we can build a strong connection between the Quran, the Sunnah, look into the life of the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam, look at the companions, and then if we look at we'll read about Bilal radiallahu anhu. We read about him. The fact that the honor, the fact that the same streets where he was dragged through, and he was pelted on, and he had a big rock put on his chest. It was those same streets that he was honored with being the first muadhin for Islam, and at the Kaaba. This is something which is an honor which we can illustrate to the people, to say, look, Islam can do it, Islam has done it, and Islam will do it. But before that, I think we have to really appreciate that. We have to understand that. And one thing that I see is that the colonialists, they may have colonized our lands and left, yes, apparently, but sometimes I feel that as Muslims, we're still colonized in our minds. And before any liberation is going to come about, we need to liberate our minds. And and the point, just to say, Rash, is the fact that Muslims only speak about those things that the media wants them to speak about, that is showing that you're not liberated. You're actually being used as a tool, as a puppet, and you feel you're doing something right, but in fact you're being played. But this discussion can continue on and on, and we have to bring it to a close. And I first of all really want to thank Brother Sim. It's been a long time coming, and subhanallah, everything happens for a reason, and it was just the perfect time with what's going on in America. And Brother Sim was available, and to get his input on this is invaluable, to be honest with you. So first of all, Brother Sim, really jazakallah khair, man.
Oh, Yakallah, thank you so much for inviting me. It's I think it was just the way it worked out. I think this was a good episode to come on your show with regards to, because there's just so much to say. There's so many more things to say after this. I just buckle up, everyone. There's going to be a bumpy ride for the next few years. I hope Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, protects each and every one of us and our families. And the state of affairs of the world, it just seems like it's going to allow us to talk about a lot of different things.
SubhanAllah. And it wouldn't be fair to sort of end without hearing more about the Mad Mamluks, Sim. I know you're doing. Is it still doing 2 podcasts a week?
Yeah, we do a podcast a week. We used to do
a Monday,
quite a bit more,
crazy Monday or something like that.
Yeah, Mad Mondays and stuff like
Mondays,
that. We had to scale it down just because we have regular lives as well, and we just were dedicating too much time. As I said, we have to spend some time on our families as well, and make sure that your host Sim's kids don't turn out to be little capitalists. That would be a pie in the face. That would be horrible.
Yeah, Allah protect them.
So, you have to balance everything out. Sometimes you get your eyes are bigger than your stomach, as they say, and you take on a little bit more than you want. But yeah, once a week, Mad Mamluks.
So yeah, guys, check it out, Mad Mamluks podcast, YouTube. You even got your dedicated website. And to be honest with you, Sim, I have to throw this in, and is the fact that Me and Rush were chatting about podcasts a while back, but what really gave me the go ahead, I'll be honest with you, was listening to Mad Mamluks. But I listened just to a bunch of guys sitting there talking about the Deen. And I'll be honest with you, I thought to myself, I even said to Rush, I go, Rush, if those brothers can do it, why can't we do it? You know what I mean? And to me, it was to us, it was a great motivation in Rush.
Definitely, without a doubt.
Alhamdulillah, man, that's awesome, and I'm so glad to hear that. And that's why when Maj told me about it, man, I made sure that I spent some time with him, talking to him about all the different experiences that I've been through, and I wanted to make sure that he's ready for it. Just so many props to you, Maj, because there's so many ways just to say, you know what, let it be someone else's problem. And even once you get this, I know Maj is working on many other side projects as well, and he's working on furthering his skills and skill set, and that's so much more important. You never ever rest on your laurels. You're always sharpening your craft and wanting to become better in every facet, from presentation to graphics to marketing to the ability to speak and entertain people. It's all wrapped up, and people just see a guy talking on camera, and I promise you, it's so much more harder than it actually looks. Because if I could invite some of these listeners who are just so easily commenting on things, like, oh well, Brother Sim, you missed that one point. I'm like, yes, obviously, yes, that was something I should have said, but like it's as a podcaster, I've become more forgiving towards other entertainers and other scholars who are in media spaces where you have a limited amount of time to speak, and 1,000 cameras on you, 1,000 eyes on you, and you have to make sure you deliver everything as coherent and efficient as possible. So it's been a learning experience, and I'm just so happy to have people like Maj around me who I talk to regularly about whatever's issues that are taking place in the world. So
Alhamdulillah. And Jazakallah khair to my co-host Rash and JK for taking the time out, inshallah ta'ala. I'm sure, JK, you have some Talking Sira projects coming soon, and we'll look hard for that. So yeah, Jazakallah to all the listeners who are listening or watching this. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we're available on all popular podcast platforms as well. So from myself and from my special co-host and guest, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Thanks for watching that video. For more exclusive videos, please like, share and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget you can listen to some of our shows wherever you are, because we're also available on all popular podcast platforms. And for more Voice of the Ummah content, make sure you check out the links to all of our social media platforms in the description below.